Yeah. Gosh.
Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of the Project GT6 Build. First off, we're healthy, we're staying our distance, and I hope the same is true for you. In spite of the current environment, we're making some good progress on the car, but there's still a ton of work that we've done to it over the last few years that I need to get you caught up on, including some pretty big news that I'm dying to share with you, soon.
In the last episode, we tackled the removal of all the old body filler and a bunch of small-ish repairs, and made good headway on the much-needed overhaul of the doors. We'll come back to finishing those off soon, but we're going to get started today by making room for some new sheet metal on the sides of the hood. Bonnet. Whatever. If you're very silent and look closely, you may just be able to spot a bit of rust in its natural habitat. Now, when we filmed this, if I knew then what I know now, we would have just chopped out the rust, hammered and welded up the arches, and slapped some James Bond effect flares on it. But sticking to the original plan of replacing everything with steel as much as possible, we pulled the trigger on an order to England, and in exchange for, as they would say, a few quid, we got some lovely new panels to weld in. In truth, the original metal was quite warped too, so this was really the only good solution. You may also be able to see a few dents along the leading edge here. Our best guess of what happened is that the car had a fight with a tree, or a moose, or an angry old lady with a baguette. Anyway, the car lost, and the hood received a bit of a bump. The individual who owned it at that time then did what I'm sure you'll agree is the obvious thing, and hammered in the rest of the nose and covered over it with Bondo. Makes total sense. We'll address the nose in episode 9, but to get started on the sides, most of the scrap sheet metal was cut out with a grinder first, leaving only the edges where the factory spot welds reside.
So if anybody wants this mint condition piece of steel for some age of Spitfire and GT6, it's over there.
Let me restate what I just said, leaving only the edges where the many spot welds reside. Yeah. These little fellas like to hide on you, and our solution has been to pre-scan the area and highlight any that we can find with a marker prior to getting out the drill. You can buy special spot weld removal bits, but we've always found a 1/4 or 3/8 inch bit usually does the trick, providing you go carefully and try not to drill through both layers of metal. We've even ground down a bit to a flat tip in order to help remove material in the corners of the welds without making a deeper recess. The cutoff wheel takes care of any remaining areas of conflict, and a flap disc helps to remove the folded seam at the back of the hood where the side is crimped around a strengthener. With all the old metal now out of the way, we can finally test fit the new panel. And look at that! It actually fits! Holy cow! I mean, this is totally what we should have done with the rear quarters. Did I ever mention that? Seriously though, this is great. Minimal time spent with some clamps, and it fits the hood beautifully. And we can see this all coming together very well. But before we push on too much more with that, we decided that this little tangent has been enjoyable, if not necessary, but we should really turn our attention back to the doors and finish them off before we get too far ahead of ourselves. Previously, we removed the skins and cleaned off all the old paint and surface rust on the frames. The driver's door needed a new base, and a small amount of rust fixed at the top. The passenger frame is in much better shape and will only need a new base, which we've already started. Care was taken to make sure the repair placed the lower edge exactly where the old one was. This edge will ultimately locate the new skin and define the door gaps, so it's important that it's placed correctly. For once in this build, we actually had the original metal to reference to, and good grief was that nice. Although we didn't yet have a brake to bend up the flanged edge, we took our time with a piece of angle iron and a hammer to get a straight line to start with. And more time was spent later on to neatly tidy up and straighten the flange with a dolly. After welding that on nicely, the corner here was created the same way as last time, and the trusty flap disc again helps smooth it out. Drain holes were added after almost forgetting, and with that we could put some primer and paint on them, as it's the last time we'll be able to access this side. Now we'll quickly skip through the installation of this skin, as frankly we'd never installed one before and needed to concentrate. And also we kept tripping over the tripod. Have you seen the size of our garage? Needless to say though, it's not rocket surgery. We opted to put a bead of seam sealer along the edge of the new skin before beginning the process, so it hopefully will seal off any moisture from getting into the seam from inside of the door. Once placed in position, it's really just a matter of slowly and carefully bending the lip over the door frame to join the two pieces together.
Ooh. Ah.
With it mounted to the car, we can finally see how the fitment is lining up. It should be good, as we took our time to ensure the doors were done properly. So what the heck is up with that gap? Ignore the hood, it never fit properly since the day we bought the car, and we'll come back to that later, but the door to sill is just not acceptable. It's actually hanging completely over the sill by about 1/4 of an inch. I've said it before and I'll say it again, we're just amateurs. This is our very first project of this magnitude. As the years have gone by and we've learned more, I continually look back at our previous work and shake my head. Case in point, we screwed up the installation of the darn sills back in episode 3, around the 6-minute mark if you're curious. Unfortunately, the lack of original reference points left on the car, coupled with minimal information on the internet at the time, left us taking our best guess at how the sills needed to go on. It didn't seem complicated. The upper pinch seam lined up in the door sill area, and the lower seam lined up with the floor. Only, in their infinite wisdom, that's not how Triumph designed it. The inner strengthener here is actually supposed to extend another inch or so towards the ground, and the sill is supposed to attach to it at that point. Yep, no idea why either. It doesn't seem like the strongest way to do it, but what do we know? Unfortunately, if we had bought replacement inner strengtheners rather than making them ourselves, this would have been obvious. But we didn't, so it wasn't. So seeing that the sill didn't fit the way we expected, we decided that the panels likely weren't stamped quite right, and all we needed to do was pull it back to where it should be. If we had taken a moment to hold the sill in place with some sheet metal screws and actually mounted the door, we would have seen this mistake instantly. But as we didn't, it's taken us 4 years to discover it. Oops. It's a classic example of test fit and then weld. So anyway, that's the story here. Let's get on with fixing this. Unfortunately, to do it properly, we really needed to cut the lower seam off and rebuild it at the correct location. But due to the panel fitment at the rear wheel well, and the fact that we had seam welded the entire car, that just seemed like way too much work, and the whole project actually ground to a halt. I think there's times in every project where you lose interest and wish you could either start again or move on to something else. This is how we felt at this point. After weeks of being depressed and making no progress whatsoever, we finally decided to ignore how it was supposed to be and just come up with a way to make it work as it is. Our solution was to cut a massive slit all the way through the top of the sill, allowing us to pull it outward and start to fix the fitment issues. I say start because, as it sits, this wasn't sufficient to completely remedy the issue. Another contender was that the hinges were allowing the door to move up and down more than 1/4 inch at the back of the door. This made it darn near impossible to know whether or not we had the door mounted in the right spot in the first place. The pins have likely just worn with age, and you can tell the difference when comparing old to new here. Add on to that, though, that we also felt the entire A-pillar was flexing. Not good! Inside the car, the A-pillar is a box section with captive nut plates and floating holders to allow for adjustment of the door. These floating holders were simply attached to a thin piece of sheet metal on the outside of the pillar, and we could visually see the body twist with only a mild amount of effort. Our brilliant solution was to reinforce it with some plates very much like what are on the doors from the factory. A CAD template helped to get the idea down, and as you can see, it will brace to both sides of the box section and even wrap around the side of the pillar to give strength in a second direction. We transferred the design to some heavier gauge steel, bent up the sides, and drilled some holes for the hinge mounts and plug welds. We'll weld them on later, as we need to tidy up the A-pillar first, but I'll tell you now that they worked out beautifully. After a lot of coffee, thinking, sleeping, and more coffee, we decided on a solution for the sills and concluded it would be beneficial to first push on with a passenger door so we could get both sides to the same point once again. Here we'll go into a bit more detail of how we did that. Most of the skin has already been attached, but this remaining area gives us an idea of what's going on. We start with a hammer to begin the bend, making a few slow passes to form it gradually, especially on a corner like this, as we're actually shrinking the metal as we go. You can see how even with taking care, it's still very easy to end up with a pointed corner instead of a nicely radiused one. These Kneepex pliers are not solely designed for this job, but their smooth jaws and parallel gripping design work beautifully for the task. We opted to protect the outer side of the door with a plate of steel to help prevent any unsightly marks from showing through. Again, a few passes, biting off a bit more at a time, and we get a very nice product. And there you go. It takes ages, it kills your forearms, but in the end, we've got lovely new skins and some seam seal to hopefully prevent any moisture from rotting out this joint. That's a win. This side will unfortunately still require the same kind of treatment to the sill later on, but otherwise the doors are at least finished. bar a few small spot welds later once we're completely happy. We have to stop and stand back occasionally to take in the whole project and get fired up again for pressing on. There's times in such a small space where you can become so focused on one part that you lose track of why you're doing this and how cool it's going to be when you're done. Just so happens it's times like these where you can also get some great ideas. We were staring at the car and taking in the whole shape, lines and curves, and came to the realization that all these external pinch seams on the back of the car ruin what we believed the shape Michelotti was actually envisioning when he designed the GT6. If you look at, say, a new Toyota Supra, you'll be struck with how beautiful and wide its rear fenders are. And somehow, the pinch seam here just breaks up visually what is also a very nice looking fender design. We also came to the realization that the seam that goes all the way around the rear fascia detracts from the simple, cut-off, almost cam-tail design of the rear end. So let's do away with all of them. Our best bet was to cut out 6-inch sections to start with, grind the panels down to the base of the pinch seam as close as we could, and then zap in some spot welds to tie it back together. Keep in mind there's an inner strengthener in the trunk area that ties in here too, so we are in fact joining 3 pieces of metal together. The rest of the seam could then be removed and welded up as well. There we go.
We gave a good coat of paint to the inside of that.
We weren't expecting to do this.
So it's burning off a lot of paint. Anyway, you get the idea.
If you're expecting a flawless finish here, sorry to burst your bubble, but it won't be just yet. You see, before even starting this, we noticed that the factory fitment of the panels wasn't going to line up once the seams were gone. So there will be a small step left behind for now, and a bit of reinforced filler will smooth them all out later on. Smoothing this off required a grinding disc for taking down the brunt of the weld with minimal damage to the surrounding panels, and a flap disc finished it up afterwards. As I said, there is a step, but if you can just imagine how it'll look once smoothed off, I really think this is going to tidy up the car tenfold. Some of you may not like this decision, as it's not traditional to the way the car was made, and our method means it will require filler, but we were never really planning on making this a perfect factory-fresh restoration in the first place, and I think after saving the car from its imminent demise, we have no reason to feel guilty for taking some creative liberties. And on that note, we have a few more creative liberties coming up soon, so brace yourself. Welding old metal can be fun at the best of times. Welding old metal with a slight gap and paint on the backside is even more so. This probably took way longer than it should have, and I have to think that a TIG welder would have left a bead that required less finishing work, though perhaps a TIG wouldn't have coped so well with the surface finish we were working with. Regardless, it was well worth the effort, and we are really pleased with the results. It's an extra touch that helps show off the actual car that was hidden under the ugly and overly efficient design purposefully engineered to make production of the car possible. We already removed the seam above the windshield in episode 6, and coupled with what we've just done here, we're going to leave it at that. We personally feel the drip rail down the sides actually plays nicely with the design of the car and gives a shadow line that we quite like. So that's it for now. Let's leave it there and pick it up in the next episode. Thanks for watching. It's been a difficult decision for me, but I decided to go full-time on YouTube back in January, and so far I'm loving it. I'd obviously love to see this channel grow, not only to actually help me meet monthly bills, but we've got stuff coming that I really think you'll be excited about. So if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button and share us with a friend. If you'd like to help in an even more tangible way, we're on Patreon and give early access to all our videos as a thank you. Links are all down in the description as always. Hope you stay safe and healthy through this time, and we'll catch you again in episode 9.
Why did we choose such a small car?